Hey everybody, today I'm talking about my top 10 board games that have replaced or killed other board games. Now what I mean by this is these are games that I've brought into my collection that have completely trumped existing games in my collection or just in my games rotation, either because they're just better or more fun or faster or more streamlined. So I've got quite a good mix of games here, from very whimsical party games up to kind of mid-weight Euro games. So let's get started at number 10. So at number 10 I have Dixit. Now Dixit is a very popular party game where you are basically playing cards to try and match a certain phrase or sentence or something, and then you're trying to, other players are trying to play a card to basically do the same, and basically you get points depending on what other players vote on who they think that original card was played by. But the game that this replaced for me was Mysterium. Now ironically, Mysterium was released several years after Dixit, but I played it in the other order, so I actually played Mysterium first. And the reason why Dixit replaced Mysterium for me is because, for me, Dixit just does the best bit of Mysterium over and over and over again in a much snappier, more fun and engaging way. For me, don't get me wrong, I do really like it, Mysterium. I've had a good time playing it over the years. But for me, there's a lot of clunkiness and a lot of superfluous rules and stuff around that core mechanism, where Dixit just cuts right through to the fun. And that's why Dixit is at number 10 for me. At number 9, I have Council of Four. Which is a kind of a medium lightweight Euro game where you're trying to build routes and stuff, get big combos, and ultimately score a lot of points. Now the game that Council of Four replaced for me was Ticket to Ride. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, is that the similarities of the route building are there, but also the way you actually build those routes in the first place. Because in Council of Four, you are basically collecting cards and cashing in those cards based on a rotating council. And you can kind of mitigate that by paying coins to make up for the difference you don't have. Whereas in Ticket to Ride, again, you're collecting those cards to try and match those train routes. Now the reason that Council of Four trumps Ticket to Ride for me is because of just the meat on the game. There's just so much more to explore, there's more to sink your teeth into, and there's bigger, more rewarding combinations you can do. Whereas, don't get me wrong, Ticket to Ride is great because it's so accessible for children and new players. But for me personally, it doesn't really get out of that kind of second gear, whereas Council of Four has a slight bigger rules overhead, but the kind of satisfaction you get out of the game just massively overrides that I would get out of Ticket to Ride. So that is why Council of Four is my number 9. At number 8, I have Age of War. Now Age of War is a very simple set collection game where you're kind of trying to collect all these different Japanese castles by matching dice symbols, and you're rolling these dice in a kind of a Yahtzee style fashion and trying to match the symbols and collect those cards. And when you have the cards, you can kind of collect them off other players and try and get more points by collecting sets. Now, there are so many games that this has replaced for me because, Yahtzee style games are generally quite popular. But a few to kind of spring to mind are Bang the Dice game. I like Bang the Dice game, but I had a problem with it where I always found that if you were ever the Renegade role, you would never ever win. I mean, I've played that game probably 20 or 30 times and the Renegade hasn't won once. And that for me just doesn't sit right, and it just feels like before the game even starts, you don't stand a chance. So Age of War just simplifies all that. Something else that sprang to mind as well was something like King of Tokyo or King of New York, where again you're kind of rolling those dice in that Yahtzee style fashion, trying to kill other players. But again, just Age of War just simplifies that in a very boiled down, streamlined game that's fun, accessible, that's small, that's portable, and just so easy to teach and ultimately more fun for me. That is Age of War at number 8. At number 7, I have Magic Maze. Now, this is a cooperative puzzle style game where you're moving these different pawns around this supermarket, but everybody's controlling every pawn, but everybody can only move each pawn in one direction. And the trick to the game is you can't communicate whatsoever, so you kind of have to just work together in silence, basically. And the game that this replaced for me is Escape the Curse of the Temple. Now, again, don't get me wrong, that's a game I really enjoy. It's a real-time dice rolling game, again, very Yahtzee style. But the problem I had with Escape the Curse of the Temple is that the game was so frantic that you couldn't kind of dictate who was playing fairly, because you could easily cheat in the game because you can't monitor what other players are doing. It's just a bit too chaotic for me, and it gets you a bit hot and bothered, and you don't often feel like that. Whereas Magic Maze is a bit more reserved, it requires a bit more concentration, and there's just a bit more nuance and kind of trickery to it that just is a lot more fun for me. That is Magic Maze at number 7. At number 6, I have Awkward Guests. Now, Awkward Guests is, for me, the best deduction game ever made. It's so good. It really has that kind of Cluedo-esque feel to, turned up to 11. Whereas, the reason why I put this on my list is because it's killed so many games of that genre or that type of deduction game. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still other deduction games that I really enjoy, but they do things a bit differently. But those kind of, as I said, those pure deduction games that are based on Cluedo or kind of adaptations of Cluedo, Awkward Guess just completely annihilates them. We used to have 13 clues in our games collection to fill that niche, but as soon as Awkward Guess came along, that was just kicked straight out because it just does everything it does a lot better. It's fun, it's engaging, it's so rewarding when you work out who's murdered who and with what, and just the deduction element of it is just absolutely brilliant. So that is Awkward Guests at number 6. At number 5, I have Push. Now, Push is a really cool, simple filler push your luck game where you are basically playing cards on these rows, trying to collect different, or trying to collect as much points as you can, but you can't play a certain number or a certain colour twice in a column of cards as you play them. And then when you collect the cards, you are also still at risk because you can be subject to a dice roll, which can lose you a lot of the cards you haven't banked yet. And the push your luck aspect of this game is so good, it is so strong, and it's just what the game is all about. And the game that this replaced for me was The Big Score. Now, The Big Score was a really cool push your luck style game that I backed on Kickstarter a few years ago. I had a lot of fun playing it, but again, it was a 45-minute to an hour game, whereas Push is a lot stronger in terms of its push your luck, and it only takes about 15-20 minutes. So yeah, it's a no-brainer for me. Push is just a great streamlined push your luck game that I think everybody should have in their collection. So yeah, that's Push, which replaces pretty much every push your luck game that I've played. At number 4, I have The Resistance Avalon. Now, this is my favourite social deduction game, as you are basically divided into 2 teams. You don't know who's on whose team, and you're trying to work out who's on what team by rooting out the bad guys. Now, if you're watching this channel, you probably know that social deduction games blew up massively a few years ago. There are so many of them, but for me, this one is the best one out there. And before playing the Resistance Avalon, I played games like Secret Hitler or One Night Ultimate Werewolf. And don't get me wrong, again, I like those games, they're really cool, but for me, the Resistance just does everything so much better. It has a much more epic feel to it. The tension is ramped up much higher than in those other games. The deduction is a lot more nuanced, and the intrigue and stuff that goes into this one is just genius. The ways all the roles blend together are just done better than any of those other games, in my opinion. So for me, the Resistance Avalon is just the pinnacle of social deduction, and I can't see that changing anytime soon. And that's the reason why it's number 4, because it's just a straight up better version of any other social deduction game. At number 3, I have Decrypto. Now, Decrypto is a very clever team versus team kind of party plus style game. It's got a few kind of delicacies or intricacies that take it above a standard party game. But it's a very clever game where you are trying to work with your team to give codes or numbered codes based on words that you can only see. But the trick to this game is that you have to not only communicate with your own team, you've got to try and be elusive enough not to let the other team intercept your code, because you can lose the game that way. But the game this replaced for me is Codenames. Now, Codenames, again, is a massively successful and popular, widely regarded, successful game. But for me, Decrypto just has the clue giving in this game is just so much more, nuanced. And as I said, the delicacy of not having to, being subtle enough that your other team can't get it, but still being obvious enough that your own team do get it or get the clues you're giving. It's just so clever. Whereas Codenames is a bit more kind of, straight face, a bit more straight laced. You can just see, the premise of the game is a lot more simple. Just give the clue and try and match as many clues as you can, and without making them land on your enemy spots. But yeah, Decrypto just takes it up to another level for me, and I can never see myself suggesting to play Codenames when Decrypto is an option. So that's Decrypto at number 3, just a fantastic game. At number 2, I have the Isle of Skye. Now, this is a really cool tile laying game by Alexander Pfister. And again, there are so many tile laying games out there. And for me, the games that Isle of Skye replaced directly in my collection, I mean, it just straight up kicked 2 games out of my collection because I think it does what it does better than these other 2 games. And these other 2 games are Carcassonne and the Castles of Mad King Ludwig. And again, 2 games that are really good and I've enjoyed over the years, but Isle of Skye is still as streamlined and accessible as Carcassonne, but still as strategic and, again, nuanced as the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, because it has that really cool auction style mechanism, very similar to Ludwig, but in this one you actually set your own prices on all your tiles, and if your opponent doesn't buy them, you have to pay that price yourself, which is quite similar to the Castles of Mad King Ludwig, but again, still, I would struggle to introduce Ludwig to more gateway players, whereas the Isle of Skye is easily more accessible for me, just a lot more streamlined and just boiled down to that core auction style mechanism and that tile placement mechanism. And the strategy of the game is a bit more in depth than Carcassonne as well, because you've got kind of varying scoring criteria each game, and at the end of every round, 2 different kind of criteria score, and you have to adjust to that. Whereas Carcassonne's a bit more, more child friendly. Just smash, your meeples down in the castles and try and complete those castles. But Isle of Skye is just brilliant, a natural step up from the Castles or Carcassonne, sorry, but a sidestep from Ludwig, but still being a bit more streamlined and a bit more accessible. So Isle of Skye, a fantastic game and definitely a strong number 2. And finally, at number 1, I have The Voyages of Marco Polo. And again, this one was, for me, as soon as I got this game, it directly kicked another 2 games out of my collection, because again, it does what those 2 games do in a lot more fun and more balanced and just better way. And those 2 games that Marco Polo replaced for me were Lords of Waterdeep and Kingsburg. And the worker placement style aspect of it is still there in Marco Polo, where you're trying to claim different regions before other players do. But the reason it replaced Waterdeep for me was because it has that contract element to it, where you're trying to collect resources to cash in those contracts to get points. And the reason it beat Kingsburg for me was because it has the dice mechanism, because Kingsburg is a dice worker placement game, and so is Marco Polo. But the problem with Kingsburg for me is that the player who generally rolls the highest throughout the game is going to win. Whereas Marco Polo, that's not the case, because although you're going to score better benefits or bigger rewards if you do have higher dice rolls in Marco Polo, you're going to have to pay for it. So it's not always good, because if you keep allocating 6s to spots, then you're going to have to pay 6 coins each time, which is can be absolutely, or it can be a no-go. So yeah, it's just, for me, it's a better game. It's no longer than those other 2 games. In fact, it's probably quite a bit shorter than Kingsburg. Again, still streamlined, not too much to explain, but the depth, strategy, the balanced, and the interest in the game is just better, because Marco Polo, you have variable player powers, which are all very powerful and enjoyable, and you feel like you can do things that other players can't do. And yeah, it's just a fantastic game by fantastic designers, and just a modern classic for me. And that's why it is my number 1 game that replaced other games, because don't get me wrong, Kingsburg and Waterdeep are still really strong games in their own right. And for a game like this to completely nullify 2 of them is just it's just a great accolade. So that concludes my top 10 games that replaced or killed other board games. I hope you enjoyed the review, and I hope you check some of these games out, because they're all really, really good. If you have enjoyed the video, please hit like and subscribe to my channel, and check out my other videos too. You can also subscribe to my, support me on Patreon or follow me on Instagram. I'll leave the links below. So for everyone else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye.